I've always enjoyed puzzle games, and the Playdate is a great handheld system for some easy pick up and play games, so I thought there was no better place for me to make a puzzle game, but what would it be was the real question. I was searching around for some inspiration when I remembered about the game Flow, which I played a little bit. If you don't know what it is, it's a really simple game where you have to connect up a bunch of pipes and fill in the entire screen. The project would be dead on arrival though if I couldn't figure out a way to make it readable on the Playdate since it's in black and white, and the original game only uses colors to distinguish between the different pipes. I workshopped a couple of things, and eventually I came up with this mock-up which just uses symbols on the endpoints of each line to distinguish which go together. I created a couple of basic assets and got it rendered on the system just to make sure it was still readable, which I think worked pretty well. The longest part of the logic was making sure that the paths were showing up when moving, and the proper sprites were being displayed when making connections. This took a bit of time to figure out since I also had to take into account the times when a path would overlap with one that was already on the grid square, so it needed to be updated. Eventually though, I got it working, so that's about it. Job's done. We now have a fully playable game. I can just set up an itch page and call it a day. While that is the main logic I needed to complete the gameplay loop, I knew the biggest time sink of this project would be creating all these levels. The idea I had for storing level data was by having JSON files with an array of levels containing rows of the grid. The level loader would go through each row in the data and place an empty grid cell where there was a 0, and an endpoint would be placed wherever there's a number. Those numbers just refer to the index of an array of the symbols I made to differentiate the paths, and the corresponding symbol is placed on top of the base endpoint sprite. While this is a pretty easy way to store the data, there's not really a great way to visualize and come up with the new levels. I could just look for some more inspiration from Flow, or I could create a tool to help make these levels. I played around with the idea of a level editor, but it just seemed like a lot of extra work, when a better idea hit me. I just went into Asprite and set the dimensions of the canvas equal to the dimensions of the puzzle grid, and I just drew in the paths with different colors. Then I would just manually type in the info for the new level. There's no need for me to come up with an entire tool when I can just repurpose one someone else already made, and this process is much faster than any level editor I would have made anyway. Next up was adding in a basic grid menu for level selection. I tested a couple of different designs for indicating a completed level, and I eventually settled on adding a little crown just so the player is able to know which ones they're missing at a glance. Using only a couple lines of code, I got this drop animation in place for the loading of the grid, which I think looks really nice. And it was really easy to implement, so that's a plus. I wanted to create some larger levels, which meant making some new scaled down assets and testing how small I could get with it still being readable on a small device. Unfortunately though, when I got to the smallest level I could, the puzzles were not as big and as difficult as I would have liked them to be. I decided to remove all the level information on the side panel and add in some extra grid cells where that was. I don't think the information was really that important for the player, and if I really wanted to change it in the future, I could just show that info when the player opens up the menu during a level. This change did break some things though, as the level loader and game manager both assumed the width and height would be the same in a lot of logic, and that just goes to show the benefit of creating systems in a more dynamic fashion, so changes like this would be easier to implement. Creating those levels for the larger puzzles was taking considerably more time to do manually though, and that's without going into all the errors I made when typing up the level data. So I decided to automate that process by creating a Python script that will automatically grab the Asprite level images and write out the JSON data for each one. I have folders for each level size that will get its own JSON file, and it loops through them, getting all the images out. For each image, it'll convert them to RGB values, and I also have a dictionary of specific RGB values that coordinate with the palette I use to make these level images. Going through each pixel in the image, I compare the RGB values to the dictionary to find the symbol ID, and I add that to a 2D array, and the results look something like this. In this form though, it's not as usable as I'd like, because I just need to know where the endpoints are, not every point on the path. So next, I loop through the array and check the spaces around each pixel to see how many sides are connected to a grid space with the same ID. Since I'm designing these puzzles with the constraint that you will not have a path directly up against another part of the same path, if there's only one connection, then that must be an endpoint. So, if there's more than one connection, then it's written to the file as a 0. Otherwise, the ID is written instead. So as you can see here, I have this level data folder, And for each size of level, they have their own folder with all the images in it. So this one lines up right here with this first level. And all I have to do now is I can just go in, I can draw in whatever I want to be the new level. Save that, run this script. And now once I relaunch the Playdate simulator, I can load it up, and just like that, I have my new level. So this just speeds everything up so much and makes my life so much easier. Since I expanded the puzzle size and removed the sidebar, I added in this text animation that will tell the player what level they're on when it's loaded. I also added this satisfying effect when completing a path, which is actually a combination of a couple things. First, there's a screen shake, followed by a circle shockwave effect, and finally some particles that are from a particle system library made by another developer and creator, possibly Axolotl, that you should definitely check out if you're making games for the Playdate. The circle shockwave effect is actually just a repurposed hit effect that I took from my other game, Reflector. I used to always be lost on how people made all these different effects, but in most cases, they're just layers of multiple effects and really aren't as complex as they seem. If you ever encounter some effects, try and see if you can break them down into their base elements, and creating them becomes much more manageable. That's about as far as I've gotten on development so far after a bit of off and on work starting before the holidays. But with the framework and tools I've created so far, I think I'll be able to crank out the content for this pretty fast. So, thanks for watching and stay tuned to the next one to see how the game turns out.